This video will be a commentary on both the short story, The Basket, and its author, Herbert J. Mangham. If you've not heard or read the story, you should do so before listening to this video, since there will be spoilers. A link to my reading of the story can be found in the description. Herbert J. Mangham was born in 1896 and lived until 1967. Not much is known about him. His middle, first, and last names are all in question. His early published stories were published with the name Herbert J. Mangham, but later it became J. Herbert Mangham, and then Herbert Joseph Mangham. Nobody is sure which of Herbert or Joseph was his actual first name. He was born in Iowa. He apparently played piano at bars and clubs and in movie houses for silent films to support himself in school. At some point, he served in the military. It's likely that this was during World War I. He would have been 21 when the draft started in 1917. Herbert Mangham appears to have done quite a bit of moving and traveling. Though he was born in Iowa, he grew up in Kansas, and at some point he lived in Kansas City, Missouri, and at some point in New York City. And he traveled to many countries in Europe, to Mexico, and to South America, and possibly other countries as well, including New Zealand. Finally, he visited Guatemala, where he lived until his death in 1967, and it's where he was buried. The Basket is a short story that was published in the very first issue of Weird Tales magazine. When I first read the story, I was very confused. When I reached the end of the story, I spent probably 15 minutes searching the pages of the magazine, expecting to find the rest of the story. I thought that surely this could not be the ending. I checked the page number of the next page to ensure that there weren't any missing pages, and I checked the end of the magazine, since sometimes stories that didn't fit neatly would be continued at the end of the issue, but there was nothing missing. However, after thinking about the story, it has actually become probably my second favorite story from this issue. And the more I think about it, the more I think it aligns well with the theme of Weird Tales. Additionally, I think the story, more than any other I've read so far, aligns with the purpose and message of this channel. In the story, Dave Scannon asks Mrs. Bueller, a landlady, if she has any rooms available for rent. She initially says no, but then remembers the basement room. It's not a very good room, and she's embarrassed showing it to potential renters. But it's perfect for Dave Scannon, who pays his rent in paper money, $7. Dave Scannon is a man of few words. He seldom speaks to anyone, and when he does, he only gives single-word answers. The other renters rarely see him. He only receives advertisements in the mail. The only information he ever shares with anyone at the house is his name and where he's from, Catawissa, Pennsylvania. Mr. Bueller thinks the name Catawissa is a funny name. During the day, Dave Scannon works at a bakery as a porter or general helper. He's never late and never early. He does exactly what he's asked, without question or complaint. In his free time, he visits the library to read newspapers silently, or visits the park where he sits alone in silence. One day, in his room, Dave Scannon dies suddenly from some acute illness, maybe a heart attack. Later, Mrs. Bueller's friend convinces her to visit a medium, just for fun. Mrs. Bueller's reluctant, but goes. The medium tells Mrs. Bueller that someone she knows has died, someone named Dave. Mrs. Bueller asserts repeatedly that she doesn't know anyone by the name of Dave, and leaves the medium's parlor, proclaiming it too creepy. As she returns home, her husband greets her at the door with some bad news. Dave Scannon has been found dead in the room. Mrs. Bueller realizes that the medium was speaking of Dave Scannon. They speak to the police and the coroner, telling them that they knew only that he was from Catawissa, and remember only because the name of the town was so funny sounding. The coroner calls officials from Catawissa, but they find no record of Dave Scannon. The police search his room, and find nothing but $5 and a photo of a nondescript girl, possibly his mother or his sister. He's then carried out in a long basket for transporting bodies. A few weeks later, Mrs. Varnes, another renter, asks Mrs. Bueller about the basket she saw being carried out of the house a few weeks previous. Mrs. Bueller suggests it was probably a laundry basket. Mrs. Varnes says she recognized it as a basket for carrying the dead, but cannot figure out who could have died. She asked her husband, but her husband says she must have been dreaming. Mrs. Bueller agrees that she must have dreamt seeing the basket. For me, it took some time for the story to sink in. It wasn't that I had trouble understanding the story, but I had trouble at first understanding the significance of the story. Until the very last sentence. The story's mundane, an uneventful story about an uninteresting man leading a boring life, and finally ending with a boring death. Mrs. Bueller's visit to the spirit medium brings us a touch of the weird, but not really much. The medium speaks in the vague language one expects of a psychic. It's Mrs. Bueller's reaction to the medium that's most important. Mrs. Bueller fails to remember that she has a renter named Dave. But Dave Scannon is not outgoing, and he lives in the basement room, and the Buellers have other renters, so forgetting Dave can easily be forgiven. It isn't until Mrs. Bueller fails to remember his death that anything unusual happens. Even when she's directly asked about the event, she still cannot remember Dave Scannon. He has been completely forgotten in only a few weeks. Throughout the story, I can draw several parallels to Dave Scannon. The first is the basement room. Mrs. Bueller has trouble remembering it, but later does because she's so embarrassed of it and of what renters will think when she shows it to them. Then there's the old lady in the north room, who I forgot to mention in my summary, but Mrs. Bueller remembers her because she is always complaining of the cold, so she takes the space heater from Dave Scannon's room when she realizes that he never uses it and gives it to the old lady to keep her satisfied. Then, when speaking to the police, the Buellers remember Catawissa, which is remembered because of its funny-sounding name. And finally, Mrs. Varnes remembers seeing the basket. She remembers it because of the macabre association, and because of the mystery of not knowing who could have died. It's likely that if Mrs. Bueller had somehow managed to remember and told Mrs. Varnes that it was Dave Scannon inside the basket, then Mrs. Varnes would almost immediately have forgotten that she had ever seen the basket at all. Dave Scannon can only be forgotten. Forgotten because he failed to make any kind of impression on anyone, positive or negative, in life or in death. Even his hometown of Catawissa couldn't remember him. At first this seems sad, but I'm not certain that it should be. Dave Scannon makes no effort at all to engage with others or leave a mark on the world. Maybe he would have no objection to being forgotten. But regardless of his wishes, this still serves as a cautionary tale for us. We will all die someday, and almost all of us do not want to be like Dave Scannon. We want to be remembered. But we need to do more than just live. We need to engage with other people. We need to do things, make things, accomplish things. But the sad truth is, even if we do make our mark on the world, there is still a danger of being forgotten. Take a look at Herbert J. Mangham, for instance. He wrote poems, short stories, articles for newspapers. He wrote for the greatest of pulp magazines, Weird Tales and Argosy. He wrote for the newspaper where he grew up. He traveled the world. He likely fought in the Great War. He was buried with military honors. And yet, we can't remember his first name. And even worse, Mangham is lucky. Many of his contemporary pulp fiction authors are even more unknown, and the stories they wrote are nearly forgotten. Which brings me to the purpose of this channel. I don't want to see these stories and authors be forgotten. I want to read and share the stories with anyone that will listen, and I want to learn as much as I can about the men and women that wrote them. Unlike Dave Scannon, they did leave their mark on the world, and they don't deserve Dave Scannon's fate. That's all I have to say about this story. If you enjoyed either listening to the story or my commentary on it, make sure you click and subscribe. Click on the bell if you want to be notified of new stories and commentary on those stories. If you want to say something about the story or author that I didn't mention, or if you want to correct me on something, or disagree with something I said, post a comment below.